Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear participants. Welcome from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. My name is Frédéric Vogel, and I'm joined here in Montreal by my colleagues Jessie Monnier, Abhinav Prakash, and Eri Tamale. Thank you for joining us today for the fourth webinar of the Knowledge Management for Biodiversity Initiative. In the past weeks, starting a month ago, we have introduced participants to biodiversity knowledge and how it could be managed efficiently following the experience of the KM for Development challenges. After that, we had some presentations by UNFWCMC and the EU about the role of the Global Knowledge Support Service for Biodiversity. And then we have learned about how knowledge management for agriculture is addressed with an example from the African continent. Last week, we heard from the Global BioPharma Initiative and their network of regional centers, and then colleagues from the knowledge management team at the ASEAN Biodiversity Center introduced us to how they share biodiversity knowledge in their region. For those who are interested to view or review the recordings, the summaries and presentations, please head to our website at km4b.cbd.int. Today, we further narrow down the scope and will address biodiversity knowledge management at the national level. The theme of today's presentations is From Theory to Action, Implementing Knowledge Management for Biodiversity on the Ground. Both presentations will be focusing on experience and lessons learned in integrating knowledge management into national biodiversity strategies and action plans, the NBSAPs. We are very lucky today to have with us two presenters that can share their long national experience about knowledge management and how they emphasize its importance when drafting their respective national strategies. Many parties to the convention are in the process of revising their biodiversity strategies to reflect the recently adopted Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And therefore, we hope that those two presentations and other information shared during the series of webinars could potentially guide some of you and further open the discussion around this topic. Talking about discussions, we have some announcements to make. Several participants have been asking if the chat function could be enabled, which we have just done, starting with this session. Please use the chat function in the Zoom system if you wish to comment or have an informal side discussion with other participants. But please take note that the panelists and the Secretariat will only be monitoring the Q&A questions and respond to questions that are posted with the Q&A feature of Zoom. The Q&A has a little button at the bottom of your application, and you click on it and you can ask your question there. Finally, for those who could not attend the live session and are listening to the recording of this session, and those who want to continue some discussion after the live, we have prepared a forum space on our website where all participants, panelists, and the Secretariat staff can further elaborate on the topics addressed during the webinars. Without further ado, let me now give the floor to our first presenter, Peter Dery. Mr. Dery is the primary focal point of Ghana to the convention. He was in New York last week to attend the SDG Summit and the UN General Assembly high-level week, and he just came back home yesterday. Thank you very much for joining us. He will share with us Ghana's experience in drafting their NBSAPs and how knowledge management was tackled. Mr. Dery, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frederick, for the opportunity. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Just 1 minute, and I'll share my presentation. Please, can you see my presentation?
This is good.
Okay, thank you. So thank you once again for the opportunity, and I'm here to just share with you, my colleagues, experiences and lessons learned in integrating knowledge management into our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So I will start by giving some little introduction to the CBD process itself and how Ghana is a party and so on and so forth. Then I will talk about Ghana's MBSA process, how knowledge management was integrated, the lessons that we learned from that process, some of the challenges that we encountered, and what is recommended to the CBD convention. We ratified that in 1994. And as we are all aware, Article 12 of the CBD focuses on the need for research and training and also recognizing special needs of developing countries. On the subject of knowledge management, if you look at the Aichi biodiversity targets, target 19 talks about knowledge improvement shared and applied. If you look at SDG 14A, there is also this request for increase in scientific knowledge. Then if you come to the recently adopted Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal Framework, you also see in that document under target 21, data, information, and knowledge for decision-making captured in there. So knowledge management is a key component of biodiversity planning, policy formulation, and implementation. So now to talk about the MBSAP, Ghana decided to respond to Article 6 of the convention, which requires parties to develop national plans and strategies that allows them to implement the conservation, the convention in order to be able to conserve or sustainably use biological resources. In terms of the process of developing our MBSAP, we use two main processes, usually through workshops and also the formation of small technical working groups that meet to do the actual technical reviews and write-ups. The institutions involved in our MBSAP process include the following. The Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources, including their agencies such as the Forestry Commission and the Lands Commission. Then we have Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Ministry of Fisheries, Agricultural Development, including their Fisheries Commission, the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources. Then the Ministry of Local Government, Decentralization and Rural Development. They are responsible for local government development. So they and also the Metropolitan Municipal and District Assemblies. These are the local government authorities in Ghana. Then the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, Ghana Atomic Energy Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, National Biosafety Authority, Land Use and Special Planning Authority, the National Development Planning Commission, the research institutions and academia, these are a lot of them, so I couldn't list them, traditional authorities, civil society organizations, private sector institutions, and then also the youth. So these are the category of stakeholders that we use. How do we go about this? We usually have an inception workshop where we share with all stakeholders what the MBSAP is about and what we are going to do. And then we also develop a methodology for the development of the MBSAP. After that, we carry out desktop review and research, looking at what institutions have done across biodiversity in the different sectors, and also trying to also research on what globally we are required to meet. After doing that, we come out with a draft outline and prepare a schedule of work for our working groups. Then we form the technical working groups who then go in smaller groups or teams to provide inputs for the writing of the MBSAP. When we have a first draft, or what is usually referred to as a zero draft, then we start the stakeholder consultations. And then the stakeholder consultations are also done categorized. So we have different stakeholder consultations, those for public institutions, those for private institutions, those that happen in the communities, those that are targeted at youth and women, and so on and so forth. Then after we carry out the consultations, we come back, we try to review the comments that come from the consultations and get experts to put the information together. Then we identify champions in the different institutions that would facilitate discussions within the institution, what we have done. Once that is done and we compile all the information, then we hold a national validation workshop where we bring key stakeholders. This is usually limited to key stakeholders, but we make sure that we have a representation across the different targets that we want to have. So we bring them together and then we carry out a validation. And once the validation is done, the document is endorsed nationally. And then the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology, and Innovation gets the minister to sign off, and then it is submitted to the CBD Secretariat. Now, when it comes to knowledge management and our MBSAP, we managed to develop a strategic objective for knowledge management. So objective 4 of our MBSAP talks about knowledge management. And the key biodiversity related institutions were tasked to undertake knowledge need assessments, mapping, and audits in their various sectors. Then we needed to carry out a peer-to-peer learning process on knowledge management. Then we look at how to build a community of practice in the different sectors, how we could share best practices. Then we establish centers for knowledge management in the different sectors, develop a system of knowledge capture, sharing, and monitoring, establish partnership to scale up and replicate successful biodiversity conservation and best practices, establish information exchange links with the national policy making bodies, and then we seek opportunities to rebuild capacity of knowledge management at different levels of training and learning. So through this process, quite a number of lessons were learned. The first thing is that we must make sure that data is available and accessible to decision makers, because without data, there's no way you can manage knowledge. Then you need to strengthen communication and collaboration among institutions, because whatever knowledge that you want to pick up must come from the institutions. Then you must increase awareness of the knowledge that is gathered. Then you try to integrate knowledge into the biodiversity framework. Participatory management of biodiversity, especially at a local level, and using the youth when it comes to knowledge management is very critical. Then the issue of traditional knowledge, how to pick up traditional knowledge. So apart from the government institutions, the well-established institutions, or the formal sector, we also have to look at the informal sector, especially at the community level. How do you have to pick up this information? Then how to compile and harmonize traditional knowledge issues, including sacred landscapes. In Ghana, there are quite a number of areas in the communities that are forbidden for people to enter, and these areas have become conservation areas. So, but there's a lot of knowledge behind some of these things, even though sometimes they are, what do you call it? Some mythical or some spiritual connotations around them. That's actually not the main reason why these sacred places have been created. The main reason is just to ensure that there is recuperation, there is reproductivity, and also that the areas are conserved. For example, people are asked not to go to the sea on certain days of the week, and then they try to coin it around some spiritual myths. But the reason is not because of that. It's just to allow the fishes to have opportunity to reproduce during the period that people don't visit the shore. So these are some of the things we need to pick up traditionally. Then how do you monitor the sectors to make sure that the knowledge that is gathered is properly disseminated? You need to also put in place various structures. Then, of course, you need people, you need technology, and you need processes, well-defined processes to be able to achieve knowledge management. There are quite a number of challenges. The first challenge we encountered was that most institutions were working in silos and sometimes are not ready to share knowledge or information. So sometimes too, the information is there, but the way the information is presented, it is not easily or readily accessible, either because of the way, the format in which you find it, or the language in which it is presented. So it becomes difficult to access. Not knowing data, information, sometimes the institutions themselves don't know that, and even forget that there's some information that exists in their sectors, and that can be a big issue. So sometimes we say the information is not there, but the information is there is because we don't know where it is, and we don't know that it exists. Then traditional knowledge systems are usually not documented. which is very critical. So you need to have people who have traditional memory to be able to tell you the reasons why maybe A or B was done to conserve the environment. Then the possibility of duplication of efforts, so you need to also find a way to avoid this. Then limited technology, for example, in Ghana, we don't have technology in terms of, even though we have GIS processes and technology available, how to access that kind of technology for such purposes, it could be a challenge, and we are trying to overcome that in our current MBSAP review that we are carrying out. So how can we use GIS, for example, to pick up information, some of these sacred sites, and then pick up some traditional knowledge? Then integration of research among institutions and discipline, how do you do that? Also becomes sometimes a challenge. Then the limited use of knowledge in defining biodiversity management programs. Yes, sometimes we tend to forget that the people who have lived with these things understand them better than those of us who probably have formal education on them or are scientists. What are the recommendations for dealing with some of these challenges? First, we need to foster coordination and collaboration among the various institutions and initiatives. Once we have good coordination processes established, then you are able to pick up the needed information and also able to disseminate knowledge. Then we need to support the generation, capture, and management and use of biodiversity-related data and information knowledge management processes. We encourage global data provided to support national stakeholders, national statistical systems. We need to look at all of that to be able to generate information, and some of them have been examples have been given here: UNEP, WCM, and so on and so forth. The use of the DAT system or the DAT reporting tool is very important. It will help bring some of the fatigue for reporting down, so that together with other convention focal points, we can all report through that system, and then we can all generate knowledge from that system and share. We need to establish information exchange links with national policy making institutions, encourage the establishment of communities of practice. Yes, this is very critical, so that from time to time people can come together, share information, and share knowledge. There's the need to build South-South cooperation for knowledge and technological sharing because of the similarities in our either geographical conditions or environmental challenges, so that we can share information. For example, countries within Africa can share experiences with their Latin American colleagues, promote participating integrated biodiversity planning, and take capacity building initiatives such as what we are doing currently through these webinars and many other opportunities, and then foster regional and international cooperation for knowledge management. So, colleagues, this is basically what I have to share with you this afternoon, and I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I await any questions that would follow. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much, Peter, for sharing. Yes. And I hope you can hear us too. Thank you for your presentation that you have prepared for us despite this busy agenda you had. And thanks for sharing the successes and the challenge one can expect when putting in place a national biodiversity knowledge management strategy. So I encourage participants to ask questions or make comments in the Q&A. There are none so far, but I'm sure many of you would have a question for Peter. Use it. It's at the bottom. You have a bottom, little button, Q&A. I could see a few chats, but I couldn't read them so far. So we will respond to the Q&A at the end of the second presentation. Talking about the second presentation, we have today with us, and we are lucky to have Mr. Han de Koeijer. He's the Clearinghouse Mechanism National Focal Point for Belgium. Welcome, Han. And he's a member of the Technical and Scientific Cooperation Informal Advisory Group. He will introduce us to Belgium's approach and how they added knowledge management in their National Biodiversity Action Plan. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frederick, and good afternoon, everybody. I had some internet problems, which doesn't happen very often up here, so I'm now on an alternate connection, so I hope that my connection is good enough. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I'll now I have to see, because there's something wrong with I share my screen, but I can't seem to change. 1 second, because I really have problems now. Let me see if it changed also in yours. Why can't, okay, I found the button. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to give you an overview of the presentation. First of all, I need to explain a little bit to you about Belgium, because we're a federal state with 3 regions, and that gives quite some difference compared to other countries, probably, on how you make your national biodiversity strategy and action plan. Then I'll tell you a little bit about our biodiversity strategy up to 2020 and the knowledge management, which will be followed by how we use the knowledge management system as we had set it up to prepare for our 6th national report. And I'll end with how we are planning to update the National Biodiversity Strategy with the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and its targets. So first of all, we've got 3 regions in Belgium. We've got, on the top, you see the Flanders region. At the bottom, it's the Walloon region. And in the middle, you see a black spot, which is the Brussels capital regions. Those regions make that they have their own competences with regards to managing biodiversity. So we've also got the federal state, and it has a special competence as well, which I'll explain in the next slide. So first of all, for the 3 regions, they are responsible for management of biodiversity and implementation of the CBD and its protocols within their territory. They also have their own regional biodiversity strategies and action plan, as well as their own monitoring system, but we'll get into that later on. Then we have the federal level, which has several competences, which are not always the same as the regions, because they have the external dimension of biodiversity agreements, which means that, for example, if we have to prepare reports, as you see on the bottom, for the EU or for the CBD, it is the federal level that is taking care of the reporting process, but it needs to involve as well the regions. It also is responsible for the coordination and the preparation of Belgian positions at the international level, which means that it's being done by the federal government and taking into account through different meetings the positions from the different regions, as well as the competence where the federal level has its competence. But it also has specific competence, such as the import, export, and transit of CITES, protected species, as well as non-protected exotic species. What does that mean? That means that, of course, the custom is still federal, but they can also ask the federal research institutions to check if the species are really correct, or they can send them as well to the regional experts for that. But also, most important, there is also still some territory that the federal level is responsible for, which is for the protection of the North Sea. So, for example, we have some special national reserves in the North Sea, which are managed by the federal level, the military domains, and also the railway embankments. So that means within the regions, if you have a railway, it means that it's the federal level that has to see if it's not a pathway for invasive alien species and things like that. So, as I already mentioned, it's also responsible for preparing joint input for EU and global reporting obligations. So what does that mean? That means that, for example, when we had to prepare for our biodiversity strategy 2020, we had to take into account the regional biodiversity strategies and their action plans, and they formed the basis on what we could do as a national biodiversity strategy. And as you've heard so far, I haven't mentioned that we have a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. No, we only have a biodiversity strategy for the national level. We reviewed our old strategy before updating this strategy, of course, because you want to know what you've done so far and what you're going to do. And we linked it closely afterwards with the Aichi targets of the 2011-2020 Global Biodiversity Strategy. But we also had to take, apart from the regional biodiversity strategy, we also had to take into account the EU biodiversity strategy. That made it, in the end, we had 15 priority strategic objectives. As you all know, the Aichi targets, I think there were 20. So we didn't take all of them into account because some were not applicable on the federal level, and the regions thought that they had their competence on it. And we also had 85 operational objectives, which is quite a big number, but I'm not going to tell you what that gives you for problems if you have to report on them. So, for example, I will not show you the whole strategy, but I'll show you a little bit how knowledge management was integrated. So, for example, you had objective 1, which is identify and monitor priority components of biodiversity in Belgium. And it had already 2 sub-objectives, as you can see. 1.1, to define a common Belgian methodology for the identification and monitoring of priority components of the biodiversity. And 1.2, identify and monitor priority species, habitats, and genetic and functional components of biodiversity. Another objective, which was linked also to knowledge management, is objective 7, improve and communicate scientific knowledge on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Well, this is, of course, the objectives, but then you still have to implement them, of course. So in the strategy, we also had monitor and support mechanisms. And here you see the 4 that were chosen. I will go into those later on. So the first strategic measure was that by 2015, adopt, apply, and publish indicators to measure progress against the strategic objectives of the National Biodiversity Strategy. This is a special one, and I'll show you that later on. The second one is that by 2015, to implement the EU reporting tool for national biodiversity strategies on the CHM website, and I'll go into that one later as well. The third one, to have a functional clearinghouse mechanism in place for the convention and its protocols, including a network of practitioners. And the fourth, by 2015, to have functional clearinghouses for implementation and technology transfer for the CBD and its protocols. So you all know about the BCH and the ABA's clearinghouse, I hope. So to go a little bit deeper in the first strategic measure is to have those indicators. The problem was that each region has their own indicators because they have to have their own monitoring system with their priorities as well. But luckily enough, we also have what we call the by 2020 indicators from the EU, which are used to monitor the habitat regulation of the EU. So we integrated them within our system. Then, of course, we also use the indicative list of indicators for this CBD, for the strategic plan, which is, as you might not recall, decision 11/3. And then, of course, we have to ensure that we use those indicators. So the regions monitor for their territory, and the federal ensures the monitoring on the North Sea, the military domains, but also for the international obligations. The strategic measure 2 was to implement the EU reporting tool for national biodiversity strategies. So what is it? Well, we already heard from Peter that he was talking about DARTS, but this is the tool that was in use within the EU and some of the Belgian partner countries, and which was later on the successor for the TCT tool. So we used that tool for the 5th and the 6th national report. The information was added. We also took the information, as Peter has mentioned, from other agreements and conventions. And because the EU decided we need to upgrade the tool, Belgium also assisted in the development of the DART that you might hear later on from. However, the TC2 tool stopped in 2019, which was a little bit a bummer because we weren't forewarned. So we still need to update the information in DART to see that it really represents all the 4th, 5th, and 6th national report for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we do not need to get the information again when we are going to prepare for our 7th national report. For the strategic measure number 3, to have a functional clearinghouse mechanism, well, we assisted the CBD Secretariat with the development of the BioLand tool, which is the successor for what we used to call the portal toolkit of the EU. And we did the migration in 2019, if I remember correctly. And you can now visit the National Clearinghouse mechanism at the links that you see up here on the screen. You see that we also use the network HTTPS from the CHM network, which is chm-cbd.net. And I believe Peter also, they recently upgraded their CHM to have it gh.chm-cbd.net. Then the strategic measure number 4 is to have functional clearinghouse mechanism for the protocols as well. We decided that the ABS clearinghouse for Belgium would be integrated in the national CHM, because we were of the opinion that information that we are supposed to share as a party to the Nagoya Protocol will have to put that anyway already on the ABS clearinghouse mechanism, and you can see the link in the second line. For the National Biosafety Clearinghouse, as we were a member of the Biodiversity Cartagena Protocol, we already had a special website for that, which you can see up there. But we also share a lot of the information that was before on another site. We put it now on the BCH straight away, and we do not have a double reporting on the National Biosafety Clearinghouse. So how did we integrate all this information that we put in our national biodiversity strategy? How did we use it to make our 6th national report? Because you have your knowledge, you have your data, but how are you going to use it? So first of all, we looked at the information which was in the EU TCT tool towards the Aichi targets, as well as the biodiversity strategy. And there was information up there for the 4th and the 5th national report. There was also information on our reply to the EU midterm review of 2060. And as well, we looked at the information on the national CHM and the BCH. The information that we could find in those different tools, we used it to put it in the reporting template for the 6th national report. So we had a look at what had we reported before, what can we use from other conventions, and then we sent the template, we sent it to the region and the federal levels to see, okay, do you have information since 2014, I believe that it was for the 5th national report. Do we have information that has been changed? Because as the federal level, we are not allowed to check the information that they have, and also they have to provide us with that information. So if we look then at the 6th national report, you will see that for the action 1.1 that I described before, we can see that the indicators, Flanders provided not only text, which I'm not going to read to you because that's far too much, but they've got a special site for an institute that is taking care of the follow-up of the indicators, which is the Institute for Nature and Forest Research. The Walloon region also have their own site with information that was used for their participation in the Sixth National Report. And the Brussels Capital Region used what they call the city biodiversity indicators. They were tested, but they weren't integrated in the Sixth National Report. For the federal level, we also have what our statistical office, which has a special page that you can see through the link up there. And we also had a look on what was up there to check it, and it was also reported in the Sixth National Report. But there was, of course, also other sites that were used. So, for example, you can see there was also what we call espèce.be or species.be, where you've got information about what species are available within Belgium, but also an observation network, which is managed by regional nature conservation organizations, where citizens can add information on what they see in the nature so that we know a little bit more, and it's not just professionals who have to look at it. The national report was reported in 2018, but we used also the information that was available to publish in 2020 the Living Planet report for Belgium. I think you might have heard it, that WWF is always publishing the Living Planet report for the world, and we each country can do it. So you can find the report, you can find it on the Belgian WWF site, and it is based on information that is available through the GBIF portal. Why did we use the GBIF portal for it? Because the GBIF portal integrates information on which are available on observations.be. So that means that if people add information to that site through an app on their smartphone, it is automatically also linked to GBIF. And also the collections, the zoological collections from, for example, my own institute, which is the Royal Belgium Institute for Natural Sciences, is also added to GBIF. So we've got a long-term proof of which species were in Belgium and how their population size changed. So, for example, you can then see that in the Royal Belgium Institute, we already have, for example, some species. We look, is the species still there? And then we decide, is that going to be one of the species that we are going to use for our priority species to conserve and to follow the state of biodiversity? Then on the second action that I showed you on monitoring indicators and assessment, as you can see up here, the Flanders has several sites that they use to monitor and to assess the state of biodiversity. So you've got the environment report, but you also have a site on nature indicators, as well as you've got the reporting that they did for an EU project, and you can find the results up there. And those were also used for the Sixth National Report. The Walloon region also does the monitoring through an indicator sheet, and you can see up there the link, and maybe later on, if the presentation shared, you can also visit it. They also used a permanent inventory of the forestry resources, because quite a lot of biodiversity is in the forest up here. Also, they've got an observatory for forest health, and you have species-based data for Wallonia that can be followed online on a special site for biodiversity of the Walloon region. Brussels Capital region also had their own assessments, and you can follow it through the link up here. And on the federal level, we also have the reports from Stadbel that were used for the Sixth National Report. So now we're in the stage that the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has been decided in Montreal. So we are now having to update our national biodiversity strategy. We're not going to update it only to the Kunming-Montreal GBF. No, we also have to take into account the EU biodiversity strategy, because that one was voted towards 2020. So we still need to take it into account. Also, other relevant international agreements like the climate change, like CITES, like Ramsar, all those we have to take into account. But also EU regulations, which have been put in place since or before since our last NBSAP. For example, there's now a regulation on soil biodiversity that has come in place, and we need to take that into account as well. And there's many others, which I'm not going to name. So, as I mentioned before, for the earlier biodiversity strategy, we had to base it on the regional biodiversity strategies. So the regions already have started to make their regional biodiversity strategies. And for example, for the Walloon region, you can see in French their strategy 360 degrees, which is on the first link. And if you look now, they're already in the stage, like Peter also said, that they're doing consultations with stakeholders. The Walloon region is doing that at this moment by a public consultation, which is running up to 4th of November. Flanders put in their nature indicators report in 2021 already a preview to what their regional strategy might be, but they were still waiting for the Kunming-Montreal GBF to update their regional strategy, and they're working on it now. On the federal level, you can find there a link with the information that I'm going to show you now. And we had to establish a special group under what we call the steering group on the CBD, which is a steering group that is comprised of the regions, the federal institutions that are linked to biodiversity, but also NGOs and others can participate in this steering group. For the contact group, however, we had to decide that it's going to be composed of representatives of the 4 governments, so the Walloon region, Flanders, Brussels capital, and the federal, and that it will be coordinated by the CBD national focal point. This is more or less the timeline that we foresee for our updating process. You can see in February, March, there was an approval by what we call the Intergovernmental Commission on the Environment. That means that the ministries of the different regions agreed that there would be an update, which is of course important because the CBD asked it, but your government has to agree on it as well. The contact group was established in March this year. And from April to December this year, the contact group will work on an upgrade or an update of the strategy with the different strategies that I showed in the slide before. So it already has met several times, and it already is in the stage that they already have a first preliminary version of the strategy, but which is still under discussion because, as you can imagine, the contact group has prepared it, but they have to send it back then to their regional governments and to the federal level. And even this morning, I was asked by the national focal point of the CBD if I could have a look on the knowledge management component of the strategic measures as I showed you before. So after this meeting, I'm going to look into that. I didn't have the time before this meeting. Then in February, April 2024, there will be a public consultations. Why at this moment? Because we will have federal elections in May, sorry, so that from May on, we're not allowed to do any public consultation anymore. Everything has to be finalized before that. And the new government can only decide on what we're going to do with that. And we hope, of course, as each country, to have an approval of our updated NBS before the deadline given by COP15, so that we can proudly say at COP16 that our NBSAP has been updated. Oh, sorry, not NBSAP, NBS. So as you can see, it's a long process, and I think many countries are in the same situation. But of course, after we've adopted the NBS, we also need to have the action plans. And as I mentioned before, the federal level, we have our own action plans, which need to be also agreed upon by the region, but the regions, they can already have their own action plans straight away. Then it should be mainstreamed into the planning activities of all different sectors whose activities are dependent or can have an impact on biodiversity. So at this moment, when we're discussing of the upgrade, it's mainly the ministries of environment that are doing the discussion. But later on, after the other ministries have also put their input, of course, we also need to talk with them on how they're going to implement it. And it should not only be an active participation for the implementation of the environment community, but all relevant actors, of course. And we already heard from Peter quite a few of those, and you can see we're also using more or less the same ones, except we're also going to the local level of government, like the communities and the provinces. So what do I already know about knowledge management for the updated NBS? As I mentioned, only this morning I got some of the information, but we know that we're going to take into account, of course, target 20 on capacity building and development and scientific and technical cooperation, because we need that to make sure that we've got the capacity to manage our knowledge. We have to take into account target 21 on knowledge management, but we shouldn't forget the implementation section of the GBF. And also, of course, we shouldn't forget the 4 decisions which are related to the GBF, which is the 4 decisions on monitoring framework, reporting and review, capacity building and development. Sorry? Okay, but those, and of course, DSI, they need to be included as well. And that is all that I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Han, for this presentation. We could witness 2 different complexities and with at your level, with the federal and the 2 regions and the cities and the EU on top of it, it becomes very complex and maybe problematic, but you seem to cope with it. Both of you have mentioned the tool DART as well, which I think is an important tool. I think it's managed by UNEP at the moment, that can help parties in reporting to the different conventions. That's very good. We have a few question and answers coming in, 3 at the moment. I hear. Is anyone willing here to read them, or should I do this from my end?
So the first question is from Joseph Masinde, which is in the Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see that.
I copied it. Yes, the moderator.
Can you, Han and Peter, can you read the question Q&A, and when they are addressed to you, you can respond to them, please?
Yeah, I'll give the floor first to Peter, because the first 2 questions are to him, I guess. So Peter, can you see the questions?
No, I can see. I've had to switch onto the phone because my internet dropped, and so I'm not seeing it clearly on the phone. But
Okay,
I can read it out, and if I have to respond, I will.
I'll read it out for you so that. So how you Mr. Joseph Masini asked the question: how are you developing your national targets and indicators? What mechanisms are you using? That's to you, Peter.
So, yeah. So thank you very much for the question. In terms of the setting our national targets, we're going through some consultative process. We just had an initial meeting for the review of our MBSAP, where we discussed how we would go about the revision process, including how we'll be setting our targets. So the targets would come from the sectors, because if you look at all the 23 targets that were identified in the GBF, they reside in different sectors. So we have the water sector, lands, forestry, oceans, fisheries, different sectors. So based on what their sectoral plans are and what they envisage in the next medium-term development plan, that is what they'll be bringing up. And then we will also have to compare that with what is really on the ground, and then to see how we can project certain figures in terms of how we'll be able to meet them. Of course, we have in our minds that some of the global targets that have been set will serve as a benchmark. So for example, for 2030, we don't expect that Ghana will go below the 30% at the national level. That serves as some kind of benchmark, in setting a target in relation to 2030. So there will be consultations. We will look at national sectorial plans and then what they intend doing from now to 2030. And then we rope that in, try to match that up with the resources that will be made available and other financial needs. And then based on the consultations, what we would agree, then the targets will be arrived at. So basically, that's the process that we are going to go through. We are yet to do that. We just had our initial meeting for the review of the MBSAP. We are yet to go through the process, but that's what we intend doing.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And then I'll take the next question, and I'll leave the last question for you again. So the question from Lawrence Sampson is, can the presenter for Belgium provide more clarity on the roles of the national focal point versus the steering committee versus the contact group in the NBSAP update process? Of course, I can try to do that. So what you've got the national focal point, which is based up here within my institute. It has mainly the role, well, not just as a post office, but also to guide the process of what we call the steering committee. So that means that they organize the meetings of the steering committees. They also provide, if there's emails from the CBD Secretariat or from the EU regarding biodiversity, they get the questions and they send them to members of the steering committee or the whole steering committee to try to answer those questions. So the steering committee is really the thing that does the actual work when we're talking about discussing between them who is going to do what, how we're going to answer, how we're going to develop our NBSAP. The national focal point itself is involved as a member of the contact group, but is not leading the contact group with their own input. It's really that is also for somebody from the Ministry of Environment who is in that contact group. So the contact group is made up of members of the steering committee that are involved. So as you can expect, as I try to explain, so one person of the Brussels and capital region, one from Flanders, one from the Walloon region, and one from the Ministry of Environment for the federal level. And that is the way that they work together, the contact group, the steering committee, and the national focal point. And that also means that, for example, once we get after April 2024, after the public consultation, if we then have the first version of the NBSAP, it has to pass something like 8 governments, because we do not only have the regions, we also have governments for the languages, 3 languages that we speak up here in Belgium. So that is more or less the way it has to go. Thank you. I hope that answered your question. Then Peter, as you cannot read them, there's another question from John Locker, which is spatial planning, landscape scale at the local level being aligned or connected with spatial data at the national level regarding traditional knowledge issues on biodiversity including sacred landscapes.
Okay, so thank you very much. Yes, that's a very important question. The challenge that we have in Ghana is that we still have quite a lot of work to do when it comes to spatial planning. We just created a new spatial planning authority some few years ago, which is trying to ensure that spatial plans are established at the national level, at the regional level, and also at the local level. So this work is still ongoing. There still has to be some work to be done before we can tie this up with knowledge management. So it might take some little time, but then we are working closely with the Land Use and Spatial Planning Authority to see how we can bring this on board. But definitely there's still quite some gap in terms of spatial planning in Ghana. That's not very well established. And so that's one critical gap that we have. And we will be looking up for some external support to bridge some of these gaps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Secretariat, I think those were the only questions that I can see in the question and answer section of the Zoom meeting. So I'll give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for managing this. It's always very interesting to hear from the parties, and I think we need to organize other sessions where we hear from other regions and on the globe as well, to hear how they share, how they address these issues of KM and biodiversity KM and in their NBSAPs. Thank you very much. Here I have Dery, who had a question, but he couldn't paste it in the Q&A. It's not available to panelists. That they cannot ask questions. So can you take the microphone there and ask your question, please?
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, I think we need to talk to Zoom. Looks like panelists are not allowed to ask questions. So my question, I put it in the chat, and was what institutional mechanisms have you put in place to continuously mobilize and verify biodiversity-related data, information, and knowledge from different sources at the national level? From government agencies, from academic and research institutions, from civil society, private sector, and the public, for example, through citizen science. So do you have a specific institution or institutions that have been designated to play this role of mobilizing and organizing the data, information, and knowledge from the country, and then making it available nationally? So that was my question. Thank you.
Okay, so I can start. So in Ghana, this is how it is. We have the clearinghouse mechanism sitting at the Ministry of Environment, and then we have a committee that supports the clearinghouse at the Ministry of Environment, which usually verifies information that is brought for CBD decision making, and also for reporting at the global level. So we have a clearinghouse mechanism established, supported by a multi-sectorial committee. Then we have focal points at each of the sectors. We've designated one institution and a focal point for each of the sectors. So, for example, when it comes to the land use sector, we have the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources. We have a focal point there who is supposed to coordinate information from that sector. We have same from fisheries. We have same from the water sector and other sectors. So that is the mechanism that we use. So the focal points generate information from, try to put together. They also have their own committees within the sectors that they work with, and they generate the information and they bring it to the committee, and then the committee does the compilation and also the verification. So that's the mechanism that we have put in place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I guess you also asked the same question to me, Dery. So like I mentioned before, it's a regional competence. So that was the big question, is how to bring those regions together to have the same thing. And I think I mentioned it briefly. For example, we use citizen science for species information, which is being stimulated, for example, by regional NGOs. We've got Natagora in the Walloon region, and we've got Natuurpunt in the Flemish region. And they organize, for example, special bird counting days. They've got special other weekend days that they do butterflies, birds in the winter, first flowering plants, and things like that. Then we've got, for the nature reserves, we've got the ministry, of course. We've got their own data, because they're going to collect the data of from up there together. And then within the region, of course, you also have the provinces. They've got their provincial information sources that will go up to them. And then together with all that information that comes from the region, then our statistical offices are going to compare it. And it will give, for example, that in Flanders region, the area has increased with so much has been increased on the protection in the Walloon region. And we also add, for example, the nature reserve in the North Sea. And that is how we come towards the 18% for the Aichi target, for example. So for the GBF targets, that will also be done that way. And they also verify, but they are not allowed to verify, of course, the information that the region brings to the national level, because there is their own competence. What else? Private sector, well, we've got some of it that we're using, and I already mentioned citizen science, so I think that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't see any more questions except a colleague from Liberia, Datuama Kamure, that hasn't posted his question there, but if he raises his hand, maybe, or she, I don't know, I can give him the floor lively. Otherwise,
Joseph.
So here, Joseph Massin there in the chat has written, Han, we have a different way of developing, reviewing our strategy. We start with national strategy, then the regions or counties in our case. Counties follow our guidelines at national level. How is your feeling about this?
Well, thank you, Joseph, for this question. Well, each country has its own way how they deal with biodiversity. And it looks to me like in your case, it's really the central government that has all the power to say, okay, we're going to do it like this. Whereas we in Belgium, due to our special system, it's really the regions that have something to say. They will also consult, of course, their counties or their provinces within it, but they are the ones that have everything to say. Because at a national level, we do not have the competence to say anything. For example, I cannot ask them, okay, it seems like that you're not reaching the goal of 18% of land under protection. I can tell them, well, maybe you should do a better effort. No, if we say that, we'll only be looked upon negatively. Okay, I'm exaggerating, of course, a little bit now, but it's not allowed to say that at the federal level, you should do more. No, it's up to them to do all the work. And it looks like for your case, it's the other way around. At the national level, you can go down and they have to follow what you decide. So I don't know which one is the easiest way, but it just depends on how your constitution is made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've seen now the message from Datuama. Even though One Health did not make it in the global targets, but based on our experience, Liberia disease pandemic, we decided to include One Health in our national targets. Please share with us your rich experience in undertaking these tasks, since this is our first time doing this. So about health and One Health. Han, has this happened in Belgium, or Peter?
Shall I go first, Peter?
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
I don't see.
Okay. Well, One Health wasn't integrated in our strategy up to 2020 as a special case. As there is now a target which also talks about the One Health, we're going to take it up. But I can assure you that we already have within what we call the biodiversity platform, we already have a discussion group between scientists and politics to talk about One Health, or how we have to take that into account, not only for zoonosis, of course, but also, for example, if you're talking about climate change, if you want to plant trees within your city, what type of trees you should use, what are the best filtering trees for CO2 or fine particles and things like that. So it's already being discussed and is going to, of course, take also part in the strategy. But as we linked everything to the Aichi target, wasn't in our current version. I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, would you like to answer this question? Or have a comment on One Health? He's not back. I can't see him. Yeah, he's muted at the moment. Maybe he doesn't know.
But I don't know why
Yeah,
my
now it's good.
system keeps freezing all the time. I don't know. Yes, so we haven't discussed about including One Health in our MBSAP. Maybe this will come up newly as part of the revision that is going to take place. But if you look at the one we did for the Aichi targets, we didn't do that. And so probably I will not have much to say as to how we're able to integrate this particular topic, but definitely it is an important one, and I'm sure it will come up because people are beginning to talk about the connections between nature, animals, and then humans. We would see how it will span up, but we don't have any experience in this area because we haven't done it ourselves also.
Thank you, Peter. So now in the chat, again from the Secretariat, since they cannot post in the Q&A, there's a question on how do you leverage the relevant technologies like data mining, knowledge tagging, and possibly artificial intelligence for integrating knowledge management in the NBSAPs. Who wants to take this one? If you are there already, or this is maybe too cutting edge at the moment.
Definitely a cutting edge for a country like Ghana on this, but it's important to leverage such technologies, and we will definitely, as we move into the future, try to work and leverage on such technology, because this is important. It gives you accurate data, it makes things easy and efficient, and so on and so forth. So it's an area we need to venture into, but quite a new area for us as a country. Thank you.
Thank you. And Han, from your end?
Okay, so yeah, I'm looking at the question. Well, I already mentioned that we do the data mining. We did it, for example, for our Living Planet report. So that is being used already. Knowledge tagging, that is what we're doing through the National Clearinghouse mechanism. So as soon as we get something, as we're using, as Peter also mentioned, we're using the BioLand tool, where we can tag towards our national biodiversity strategy, as well as the Aichi target. And I saw recently that the tagging is also possible for the GBF. So that we hope that when we get to the 7th national report, we can all use all the text that we've used within the BioLand tool, that we can have an overview on what we've done, or what reports are there available, what projects were implemented with regards to each target. Artificial intelligence, we haven't thought about it, because we're mainly hearing about that they're reproducing songs, they're producing text and things like that. But we haven't had a look yet if we want to use artificial intelligence to prepare our report. I think we, as the reports are quite, how do you say it, still political. I think we'll use our policies to do it. So I'm not sure if we're going to use artificial intelligence at this moment, but it can change, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Another question on the chat here from Bintusia Foremusa. How can we ensure synergy with other national strategies such as NDCs or other climate-related strategies to ensure the nexus between biodiversity and climate change? Again, Han or Peter, who wants to start? Or
yeah, I can start for a change. Well, as we all know, there's already a target which is quite linked to climate change. So that means that, for example, we are preparing at this moment within the EU, we're preparing the Substat 25. And one of the subjects that will be discussed during Substat 25 is the monitoring framework. So then when we come to the questions for the headline indicators or the binary indicators, we ensure straight away that the people who are dealing with climate change, that is them who are going to look at those binary questions and not the people from the biodiversity part. Of course, they're looking at it as well, but they first will try to get the opinion of the people who are involved in climate change. But of course, we also try to ensure that in each convention, there's 2 or 3 people involved in both subjects to ensure that they are taking into account. So, for example, I mentioned that we had a steering group biodiversity, we have a steering group climate change, but we also have a steering group environment between the different regions, and they come together then. The 2 different steering groups come together up there as well. Thank you.
thank you, Peter.
Yes, so for us, it is much easier because the 3 Rio conventions focal points reside within one ministry. There's the Ministry of Environment. So they all report through one system. So it's easier to coordinate information sharing and also bringing us together to report on certain targets. Beyond that, you have to create a platform for the focal points to be able to meet from time to time to discuss targets that relate to the work that they do. For example, the UNCCD focal point is very critical when it comes to GBF. There are certain targets that relate to them, and of course to climate change. What we also do is that from time to time, we will try to hold meetings between the National Biodiversity Committee and the National Climate Change Committee to look at areas of synergies. We do this through what is known as the Environment and Natural Resources Group or Committee, which brings all the focal points together in a meeting. And sometimes we even hold it with our colleagues from the DP side. So through that process, we are able to exchange information amongst ourselves as different focal points. So that's what we do at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Another interesting question here from Lauren Sampson. I had a similar question in my mind, and it's good that this comes up. Mr. Peter mentioned that one of the challenges for Ghana was being able to integrate traditional knowledge. I'm not sure if this was mentioned during the presentation specifically, but what are the barriers to success in this area? How active are IPLCs in the national update process?
Okay, so the challenge with traditional knowledge is because currently it's not being documented. It's not being documented. So you need to really get the right people to be able to give you oral information. And that's where sometimes the challenge comes. Once it's not documented, it becomes very challenging. And sometimes when information is passed on from one generation to another, sometimes there are a few distortions that emerge. as part of that process. Then also how to sometimes break terminologies from the traditional language to scientific language becomes also sometimes a little challenging there. What we are doing is to identify certain experts who are good in traditional knowledge management at the universities. We have certain faculties that are good at this, who can interpret very well whatever information that we pick up, from the communities, to make sure that we don't distort the scientific meaning that we give to some of the information that we gather. So that is where the challenge is. And of course, we try to use these experts, but of course, the experts are also limited. And so it's still not fully resolved, but we try as much as possible to manage with the information that we have and use these experts to bridge the gap in the meantime. So that's what I meant by it was in the presentation as a challenge. If we go back to the slides that I presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. This is a very interesting subject all the times with this fair and care principles, and as well the prior informed consent. And I was wondering if those communities were giving this information openly and were happy to share, or if it was difficult as well at this level. Can you elaborate a little bit, Peter? And I'm sorry, it's like an interview. We're trying to get as much knowledge from you out here to the public. Thank you.
Yeah, in some cases, yes, they are willing to give, but there are some that they also are very reluctant or reserved when it comes to giving out some information, because they think that others will get to know it. And then, of course, we try to explain to them, try to get their consent, because that is required. But consent sometimes is not enough to convince them to give you certain information. Some, they are very open, but it depends on the kind of information that sometimes we need. When it's very sensitive to their cultural heritage, they are a little reluctant, no matter the consent you try to seek from them. Thank you.
Of course, yes, thank you. We have a question online from John Locke. And Peter, with climate change and movement of species to higher elevation or further northwards or southwards for cooler climates, how would you address or facilitate the movement of a species and its related traditional knowledge from one indigenous peoples to another? Oh, that's a complex one, I guess. Maybe you could start, Peter?
Yeah, so definitely you can't stop the species from moving. I mean, there are no barriers. You cannot request for visas from species before they move from one traditional area to another. And then, of course, this becomes another challenge. Once there's no documentation and they move, then it becomes difficult to trace the history behind these species. And that's one critical area we find as a gap currently, which we need to work together as a country to, which I actually brought up as a challenge in my presentation, which we need to work to find a way of ensuring that this information is, when the information is properly documented, archived, and kept well, it doesn't matter where the species will be found. You can easily always trace and go back and know where they came from and whatever information that is around them. But as it is, it's still quite challenging, definitely. And we have identified, once we identify the gap, we work as a country to see what technologies, what methods we can use, to make sure that we are able to preserve information in spite of the movements of species. There's nothing you can do about it. Climate is happening on a daily basis. Until we resolve the climate problems, species will continue to move, because they will always look for conducive environment, to live. Just as humans also, even human beings are moving. If you come to Ghana, people are moving from one location to another. People are moving from the north to the south because of climate change. People are moving from the coast because the coastal areas are getting inundated because of climate change. These movements happen. They will affect cultural heritage and information, but then you can't stop it. And so the only way is to try as much as possible to get the information from its source and try and document it, keep it very well, so that when movements happen, the information is not distorted. Thank you.
You and Han, from your end in Belgium?
Well, we don't have any IPLCs or recognized IPLCs, so we do not take that into account when we're talking about species moving. However, what we see as is that, for example, if we look at the forestry sector, we can already see that they're starting to use species that are a little bit more drought resistant for higher areas. For the lower areas, they're also planting species that are more wet resistant, because that's the problem that we have at this moment in Belgium. On the higher grounds, there's how do you say, the temperature is rising quite fast, but also we have more rain in the whole of the country, and also stronger rains, which means that we've got more inundations like everywhere in the world at this moment. So those in the valleys, they need to be more adapted to having wet feeds. That is the thing that we do. But we only use species that are at this moment from within the EU. But we've got more problem with invasive species that they can now adapt up here in Belgium, because before we used to have cold winters and a lot of tropical vector species like mosquitoes, tiger mosquitoes especially, or I can see now flying in front of my window a parrot that has established. We really get the problem now that pests and invasive species that didn't exist up here before are really getting established now, and that is what we really have to work towards, and it's that is the biggest problem at this moment. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much. There is again an internal questions here, and we near the end of the webinar soon, so bear with us with this one still. Have you already or plan to put in place national policies and standards regarding biodiversity data, information, and knowledge management? Han, would you like to answer this first?
Yeah, thank you, Eri, for your question. Well, we already have quite a lot of regulations in place, because most of the information regarding data, knowledge management is being decided on European level through different EU regulations. So as you all know, we have open access with regards to all data, in principle, when it's paid for by the EU or for national, regional level. So that is quite clear. And the standards that we're using is Darwin Core already since quite some time. And we of course take into account, for example, when we're doing the citizen science, to ensure that we can talk with the GBF platform, to ensure that we do not need to do anything manual anymore, but everything is automated. And yeah, for the georeferencing, we use all the international standards as well. So that is already quite well in place. And it is just a general information for everything. We do not specify specifically for biodiversity, knowledge management, and data and information. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And from your end, Peter?
So Ghana has data management policy and also regulations, but these are general in nature. They are not specific to biodiversity, but they apply. Once you are dealing with data and information, they apply. So that's what we are using. We don't have specific ones for biodiversity as we speak. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and a question here from this room, from Abhinav. One of the challenges many parties face is the area of sharing information across different institutions in a standardized way. Can you please shed some light on how this has been managed, for example, using data interoperability? Han, you first again.
Okay, well, that's more or less the same. Thank you, Abhinav, for your question. Well, it's more or less the same answer that I gave before. Because as we have to report to the EU, we've got, for example, what we call EONet, which is a network of national and regional institutions which are reporting directly through in a standardized way to the European Union, so that they can monitor how the state of biodiversity is. So all this is already in place, and it, of course, within Belgium, we do it exactly the same way, because the raw data is collected in the same way. It is then, of course, sent by each region to the EA. So it's all centralized. They really all go into the same direction. Of course, except for the large collections that are in federal institutes, which haven't had much geolocalization, but that's work that is going to be done. So it's data interoperability is in pace. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see we have lost Peter, so I wanted to thank him before he had left, but I don't see him. Or Peter, are you still here? Maybe he has lost connection. Anyway, I think it's time to close this webinar for today. I think as well that the opening of the chat was successful and people could share. I was happy to see many people present and sharing their comments there. That's very good. We'll keep this open for next webinar. So talking about the next webinar, let me find the topic that we had in mind here. So the next webinar will be on the 3rd of October. And we wanted to address knowledge management in biodiversity project management. And we had in mind to invite colleagues from international organizations, FAO and Jeff. And we still do not have a confirmation that they can participate. We will keep you informed. We have probably an FAO colleague that can share some knowledge on one of their projects they run at the FAO level. We will keep you informed on that one. First, before we leave, so I would like to thank both of you. Peter is not in, I think, but I will tell him personally later. Thank you very much for your time, for your knowledge that you have shared today with us. As I said, I think we should continue and invite more of the parties to hear from them, the difficulties, or the challenges, and how and the successes they have across the globe in other sessions, possibly. I invite the participants to join us at the next meeting and to continue the conversation on the forums if they have more questions. Is there anything here from the CBD table? And Han, any final words from your end?
No, I would like to thank you for inviting me. Especially, it assisted me to put also knowledge management again in the contact group as a question, because I was afraid they had forgotten about it. As I'm not part of their contact group, but they assured me that they're taking it into account, and I hope to see that the knowledge management will be used again for the different reports that we have to present. So thank you also to the secretary to invite me. Thank you.
Dery, you wanted to have some final words?
To add a few remarks as well, to thank all of you and the two presenters. We know it takes a bit of time to prepare for this, and thank you for agreeing to share your experiences. And And we want to encourage parties to make use of this information, and especially now as I think most of you are in the process of revising and aligning your NB SAPs with the GBF. So an opportune time to think about integrating knowledge management into your NB SAP. So reach out to us, reach out to those who have presented today and those who have done it before. And we'll be trying to reach out to more parties to ask them to share their experiences. And the key point is to make sure that we don't lose the opportunity of the ongoing revision of the NB SAPs to address these aspects and integrate them. So thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Have a nice week ahead, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.